Imagine, if you will, the biting chill of a late autumn morning, the year 1944. A troop transport ship, its hull scarred by countless Atlantic crossings, finally docked at a quiet port in Maryland. On board, a group of women, their faces etched with the strain of war and a long sea voyage, stepped onto American soil. They were German prisoners of war, a reality almost unthinkable just months prior. Their minds, for years, had been fed a steady diet of Nazi propaganda, painting America as a decadent, industrially weak nation, its military a mere shadow. Yet, what awaited them was a revelation that would slowly unravel everything they believed. Before we delve into this incredible story, a quick question for you. Where in the world are you watching this from today? Share it in the comments below. Among these women was Helga Mueller, a young German woman whose motivation was starkly simple: survive and somehow find her family. The salt-laced wind whipped at her thin, worn coat, a garment that had seen better days, much like her homeland. Clutched deep in its pocket, a small, creased photograph offered her only solace: a faded image of her parents, a silent promise she carried across an ocean. She glanced at the vast, unfamiliar landscape, the immense docks. The sheer number of vehicles, and a tremor of disorientation ran through her. This wasn't the America she'd been told about. This was something else entirely. Overseeing the processing of these new internees was Captain Eleanor Vance, a no-nonsense officer with a sharp gaze and an even sharper mind. Her job was to maintain order, assess threats, and uphold the complex regulations governing prisoners of war. She watched the women disembark, a mixture of defiance and exhaustion in their eyes. For Captain Vance, these were not just enemy combatants. They were a puzzle, a living testament to the conflict's pervasive reach. Her initial reports to the Provost Marshal General's office noted their unusual discipline, but also a palpable undercurrent of bewilderment. As they observed the bustling American infrastructure, she wondered, as she often did with new arrivals, what exactly they expected, and what truths they would be forced to confront. The journey from the port to the internment camp was equally disorienting. Helga, pressed against the window of a train car, watched the American countryside rush by. Unbombed cities, sprawling farmlands stretching to the horizon, trains laden not with troops, but with endless goods, passing them in the opposite direction. The rhythmic clack of the wheels on the tracks seemed to underscore a prosperity she couldn't reconcile with the scarcity her family endured back home. She saw neat houses, children playing in yards, a world untouched by the brutal physical scars of war. It was an overwhelming sensory assault. The faint smell of freshly baked bread from a distant town, the sight of vibrant green fields, the rumble of a passing freight train carrying what looked like mountains of coal. This initial glimpse planted a seed of doubt. How could a nation so seemingly untouched, so abundant, be anything but a formidable power? What was this military arsenal they had been warned about, if not just tanks and planes? And how would a single precious photograph, clutched in a desperate hand, stand against the sheer overwhelming scale of this new reality? These questions, born of paradox, would begin to unfold in the quiet, contained world of the internment camps. The train finally shuddered to a halt, a metallic groan echoing through the chilly air, far from the bustling docks. For Helga and the other women, the next phase of their bewildering journey began with the sharp clang of heavy gates closing behind them. This was Camp Fort Howard, Maryland, one of several facilities designated for female internees. The air inside smelled not of war's decay, but of fresh paint and a sterile disinfectant, a scent utterly alien to Helga's memory of bombed-out cities. She ran a hand over the rough, clean wood of her bunk, a stark contrast to the splintered debris that had once been her home. This wasn't the ramshackle, barely held together enemy infrastructure Nazi propaganda had promised. This was organized, almost pristine. Captain Eleanor Vance, observing the new arrivals from the camp administration building, noted the universal expression of guarded curiosity. Her daily reports to the Provost Marshal General's office often highlighted these subtle shifts in demeanor. Initial defiance, quickly yielding to acute observation of camp amenities. She dictated to her aide on November 12, 1944. The women were assigned barracks, each surprisingly sturdy, with beds and blankets that, while utilitarian, were a luxury compared to what many had left behind. The electric lights hummed with a steady, reliable current, illuminating spaces that felt impossibly bright after years of blackout conditions and flickering candles. How could a nation so seemingly untouched, so abundant, prepare so efficiently for the arrival of its enemies? What did this meticulous order truly signify about its power? The true shock, however, arrived with the first meal. The mess hall, a cavernous space filled with the low murmur of hundreds of voices, initially felt intimidating. Helga remembered the gnawing hunger that had been a constant companion in Germany. The thin gruel, the ersatz coffee. But here, the aroma of cooked meat and vegetables filled the air, a rich, savory scent that made her stomach clench with an unfamiliar anticipation. She watched, wide-eyed, as plates piled high with actual roast beef, mashed potatoes, and fresh green beans were distributed. The bread was real, dense and warm, not the sawdust-filled loaves of wartime Germany. The clatter of cutlery against ceramic plates was a symphony of alien abundance. Dr. Ana Rodriguez, a psychologist working with the internment program, made it a point to observe the mess hall during mealtimes. She noted in her confidential journal entry from that week that the initial bewilderment often gives way to a quiet, almost reverent consumption. The sheer quantity of food, the absence of rationing, seems to disarm them in a way no interrogation ever could. She saw women. The contrast between the propaganda of a starving, struggling America and the overflowing plates before them was profound. This wasn't just sustenance, it was a psychological weapon, far more potent than any bomb. If you find yourself intrigued by these hidden corners of history, where personal stories intersect with monumental events, consider subscribing to Whispers from WW2. We delve deep into the untold narratives that shaped our world, bringing you the precise details and authoritative insights you won't find anywhere else. It helps us continue shedding light on these often overlooked moments. Helga, clutching a warm mug of surprisingly good coffee, felt a growing dissonance. Her photograph, still in her coat pocket, represented a world of scarcity and struggle. This new world, with its unlimited food and steady electricity, spoke of an entirely different kind of power. It wasn't just the visible machinery of war that mattered, was it? It was the invisible engine that ran beneath it all. What did it mean for a nation to have so much, to produce so ceaselessly, even as it fought a global war? How deep did this industrial and agricultural capacity truly run, and what did it imply for the ultimate fate of her homeland? These questions, born of full stomachs and brightly lit barracks, began to erode the foundations of her ingrained beliefs. The initial shock of abundant food slowly gave way to a deeper, more pervasive realization of American capacity. It wasn't just the mess hall, it was the barracks themselves. Helga noticed the quality of the blankets, thick wool that offered genuine warmth, unlike the threadbare coverings she'd known. The mattresses, while simple, were filled adequately, providing a comfort she hadn't experienced in years. Even the basic toiletries distributed, soap that lathered generously, toothbrushes that weren't worn down to nubs, spoke of a production scale beyond anything she could have imagined. She remembered the harsh, abrasive wartime soap in Germany, meticulously rationed, and the scarcity of even the most fundamental items. Here, the scent of clean laundry to creep over the land, fresh from the camp's own facility, permeated the air, a subtle but constant reminder of an unseen industrial engine. Captain Vance, in her intelligence briefings, often highlighted these seemingly minor details. A memorandum dated December 5, 1944, to the Assistant Chief of Staff, G2 noted a marked decrease in requests for personal care packages from Germany, suggesting an unexpected satisfaction with camp provisions. This wasn't merely about meeting basic needs, it was about exceeding the expectations of women who had lived under severe austerity for years. The contrast was stark. The propaganda had painted America as struggling, its industries stretched thin, yet here was tangible proof of a nation capable of supplying not only its own massive war machine, but also the daily comforts of its prisoners. How could a country at war maintain such a level of domestic production, even for its enemies? What hidden mechanisms allowed for this seemingly endless flow of goods? As weeks turned into months, some of the women were assigned to work details within the camp, tasks like laundry, kitchen duty, or maintenance. These duties, while mundane, offered new perspectives. Helga, assigned to the camp laundry, watched mountains of uniforms and linens pass through industrial-sized washing machines and dryers, roaring with a power that spoke of vast energy resources. The sheer volume of water, heated and readily available, was another quiet marvel. She thought of the desperate measures back home to conserve every drop, every flicker of electricity. The crisp, clean smell of the freshly laundered sheets, still warm from the dryer, was a sensory affirmation of an infrastructure she couldn't reconcile with the image of a nation teetering on the brink, as depicted by Nazi broadcasts. Dr. Anna Rodriguez, ever observant, expanded her psychological assessments beyond mere interviews. She introduced structured observation periods, noting how the women interacted with their environment. Her journal entry of January 15, 1945, detailed her findings. The initial shock of material abundance has evolved into a quiet, almost analytical curiosity. Detainees are not simply consuming, they are observing the process of production and distribution, often comparing it explicitly to their experiences in Germany. This wasn't a military arsenal of tanks and planes, but an economic arsenal of factories, farms, and an intact civilian life that fueled it all. What did it mean for a nation to be so untouched, so productive, when her own country lay in ruins? Sometimes the women were transported for medical appointments or transfers, offering fleeting glimpses of the world beyond the camp fences. Helga remembered one such journey, the truck rumbling down a paved road, smooth and free of craters. She saw towns with intact buildings, bustling main streets, and stores displaying goods in their windows. Not just food, but clothing, household items, even toys. The sight of children, well-dressed and laughing, playing freely in parks, etched itself into her memory. There was no rationing for them. The air carried the faint, distant hum of civilian life, a stark counterpoint to the drone of bombers and the crackle of gunfire she had grown up with. This wasn't the image of a struggling, war-torn nation. An intelligence report from late February 1945, referencing debriefings of returning work detail supervisors, corroborated these observations. Prisoners exposed to external civilian areas frequently express astonishment at the unbroken nature of American infrastructure and the apparent normalcy of daily life. This is often contrasted with their prior understanding of the global conflict's impact. The report highlighted a growing dissonance in the prisoners' minds, a quiet fracturing of their ideological foundations. The military arsenal wasn't just about the visible instruments of war. It was about the invisible, underlying capacity of an entire society that seemed to operate with an endless supply of resources. How could a nation so engaged in a global conflict maintain such an undisturbed domestic front? What did this unprecedented resilience truly signify about the shape of the coming peace and the future of their own defeated nation? The questions lingered, not just for Helga, but for many of the women. How could a nation so engaged in a global conflict maintain such an undisturbed domestic front? And what did this unprecedented resilience truly signify about the shape of the coming peace and the future of their own defeated nation? The answers, subtle and insidious, began to reveal themselves not in grand proclamations, but in the quiet corners of daily camp life. One such corner was the camp library. For Helga, the initial surprise was simply its existence. She remembered the book burnings, the strict censorship, and the scarcity of paper in Germany. Here, in a prisoner of war camp, a small building hummed with an almost sacred quiet, its shelves laden with books. The air inside carried the faint, comforting scent of aging paper and dust, a stark contrast to the metallic tang of wartime fear. She saw not only English texts, but also German novels, history books, even scientific journals. A report from Captain Vance, filed in early March 1945, mentioned the unexpectedly high utilization rate of the camp library by internees, particularly for non-fiction works and German-language literature. It noted that the collection, which reportedly housed over 1,500 volumes in various languages, had become a significant point of interest. What did it mean that their captors offered not just food and shelter, but access to knowledge, even to enemy narratives? Dr. Ana Rodriguez, whose psychological assessments had evolved into broader sociological observations, noted in her journal on March 20, 1945, that the library functions as a subtle yet potent instrument of re-education, not through overt propaganda, but through the sheer availability of alternative perspectives. She observed women poring over maps of the world unretouched by Nazi cartography or reading American newspapers, translated snippets of which often circulated surreptitiously. The crisp rustle of a turning page, the quiet murmur of women sharing a passage, became a new kind of soundscape, eroding the monolithic narrative they had once believed. Helga herself found solace in an old, leather-bound copy of Goethe, but her eyes often strayed to the American newspapers. Their headlines screaming of battles she knew, but their accompanying stories painting a picture of a nation that felt entirely alien to the one she'd been taught to hate. Beyond the printed word, another profound contrast emerged in the very people who held them captive: the American military personnel. Helga watched the guards during their rounds, their uniforms clean, their boots gleaming against the gravel path. They were well-fed, their faces unlined by the gauntness that had become common in Germany. The rhythmic crunch of their footsteps, firm and confident, spoke of a stability she hadn't associated with the enemy. An internal intelligence brief from April 1945, focusing on internee perceptions of their guards, noted that prisoners frequently comment on the physical health and apparent morale of camp personnel, often expressing surprise at the quality of their rations and equipment, which consistently exceeds expectations for a nation supposedly exhausted by war. Captain Vance, ever attuned to the nuances of human behavior, recognized this as a critical, unspoken form of psychological warfare. She oversaw inspections where the guards' mess hall, though separate, was deliberately kept to a standard that would be noticed by the internees, even through glimpses. The smell of freshly brewed coffee, a luxury in Germany, often wafted from the guardhouse. The sheer number of vehicles, the efficiency of supplies, the seemingly endless flow of resources that supported even the most junior American soldier painted a picture of an economic machine operating on an entirely different scale. How could a nation so strong, so abundant, have been so consistently underestimated by her own leaders? What did this suggest about the true nature of their enemy's power and their own vulnerability? The quiet, almost mundane reality of American abundance, observed in the library's shelves and the guards' steady stride, continued to chip away at the foundations of Helga's worldview. It wasn't just the military arsenal of tanks and planes. It was the entire, seemingly inexhaustible industrial and agricultural infrastructure that supported it, visible in every detail. The unbombed scale of American cities glimpsed from train windows, the trains laden with goods, not troops, stretching for miles. The very quality of their captors' uniforms. Each detail was a tiny hammer blow against the edifice of Nazi propaganda. It was a revelation that the war's outcome, might have been predetermined not just by battle tactics, but by an economic capacity they couldn't even begin to comprehend. What would it mean for the future? When the full weight of this reality finally settled in, the quiet, almost mundane reality of American abundance, observed in the library's shelves and the guard's steady stride, continued to chip away at the foundations of Helga's worldview. It wasn't just the military arsenal of tanks and planes. It was the entire, seemingly inexhaustible industrial and agricultural infrastructure that supported it, visible in every detail. The unbombed scale of American cities glimpsed from train windows, the trains laden with goods, not troops, stretching for miles, the very quality of their captors' uniforms. Each detail was a tiny hammer blow against the edifice of Nazi propaganda. It was a revelation that the war's outcome might have been predetermined not just by battle tactics, but by an economic capacity they couldn't even begin to comprehend. What would it mean for the future when the full weight of this reality finally settled in? This understanding deepened with every passing week. Helga, during her occasional transfers to medical facilities outside the camp, noticed the sheer density of the rail network. The rhythmic clang of switch points, the long, low whistle of an approaching locomotive, became the soundtrack to America's relentless productivity. She saw freight trains, not just passenger cars, stretching for what seemed like miles, carrying lumber, coal, steel, and countless other raw materials to unseen destinations. The air around the tracks often carried the faint, metallic scent of industry, a stark contrast to the acrid smell of burning rubble she associated with German rail lines. This wasn't a nation struggling to move a few vital supplies. This was a logistical behemoth, churning out resources with an almost casual efficiency. Captain Eleanor Vance, reviewing intelligence summaries from other internment camps, found a pattern emerging. A report from Camp Ruston, Louisiana, dated May 10, 1945, highlighted recurrent prisoner comments regarding the uninterrupted flow of civilian goods observed during transit, particularly the volume of freight traffic. This directly contradicts established enemy propaganda regarding American industrial collapse. The sheer visible scale of this internal commerce, seemingly unaffected by a global war, presented a paradox that few of the internees could reconcile. How could such an immense war effort be sustained without crippling the civilian economy? What colossal engine drove this endless procession of goods? The answer, in part, lay in the vast, fertile heartland of America. While Helga rarely saw actual farms up close, the evidence of their bounty was everywhere. The abundant food in the mess halls, the fresh produce that occasionally made its way into their diets, the sheer variety of grains and meats. She remembered the carefully cultivated, often bombed-out fields of Germany, the desperate measures to maximize every small plot of land. Here, the landscape, even glimpsed from a moving vehicle, conveyed an impression of limitless expanse, of fields stretching beyond the horizon, untouched by the scars of conflict. The scent of rich, dark earth, carried on the occasional breeze, spoke of an agricultural power that felt almost mythical. Dr. Ana Rodriguez, in her ongoing psychological assessments, began to specifically probe these observations. Her journal entry from June 1, 1945, noted, "The perception of American agricultural abundance is proving to be a highly effective, albeit unintentional, counter-propaganda tool. Detainees express particular disbelief at the sheer lack of rationing in the civilian sector and the quality of basic foodstuffs." This wasn't about tanks or planes, but about bread and meat, the very staples of life that had been so scarce in their homeland. The profound difference in daily sustenance wasn't just physical relief, it was a deep psychological blow, undermining the very premise of their nation's struggle. If this insight into America's true, overwhelming capacity has reshaped your understanding of the war, please consider giving this video a like. It truly helps us bring these forgotten stories to light. This slow, creeping realization of America's immense industrial and agricultural infrastructure was far more insidious than any direct military encounter. It was a war fought not with bullets, but with abundance. The knowledge that America could wage a global war while simultaneously feeding its own vast population, maintaining an intact civilian economy, and even providing generously for its prisoners, began to fundamentally shift the internees' perspectives. Helga, clutching her faded photograph, now saw her family's struggle for survival through a new, stark lens. Their suffering wasn't just a consequence of war, it was a consequence of fighting a nation whose true power had been catastrophically underestimated. The Nazi propaganda had painted a picture of a decadent, industrially backward America, yet every sensory detail, every observation, screamed a different truth. What would this recontextualization mean for their understanding of the war's end, and their own place in a world utterly transformed? This slow, creeping realization of America's immense industrial and agricultural infrastructure was far more insidious than any direct military encounter. It was a war fought not with bullets, but with abundance. The knowledge that America could wage a global war while simultaneously feeding its own vast population, maintaining an intact civilian economy, and even providing generously for its prisoners, began to fundamentally shift the internees' perspectives. Helga, clutching her faded photograph, now saw her family struggle for survival through a new, stark lens. Their suffering wasn't just a consequence of war. It was a consequence of fighting a nation whose true power had been catastrophically underestimated. The Nazi propaganda had painted a picture of a decadent, industrially backward America. Yet every sensory detail, every observation, screamed a different truth. If this insight into America's true, overwhelming capacity has reshaped your understanding of the war, please consider giving this video a like. It truly helps us bring these forgotten stories to light. The true recontextualizing turn for many of these women wasn't a single dramatic event, but this slow creeping realization. The military arsenal America wielded wasn't just about tanks and planes, but the entire seemingly inexhaustible industrial and agricultural infrastructure that supported it. Intelligence officers like Captain Vance began to note a shift in interrogation reports, with less ideological defiance and more pragmatic curiosity about American systems. Dr. Rodriguez's psychological assessments, detailed in her confidential reports, indicated a growing willingness among some detainees to engage with educational programs, even those focused on American civics, leading to a quiet expansion of camp libraries, some reportedly housing over 1,500 volumes in various languages. The crisp scent of new paper within those library walls, the quiet turning of pages, spoke volumes. This reality fundamentally undermined the Nazi propaganda they'd been fed, which had painted America as a decadent, industrially backward nation. It was a revelation that the war's outcome might have been predetermined not just by battle tactics, but by an economic capacity they couldn't even begin to comprehend. The immediate practical consequences rippled through the camps. Letters home, though heavily censored, began to include subtle references to the unexpected order or surprising resources of their captors, hints that would only gain full meaning after the war. The debate over their repatriation post-VE Day became a complex administrative puzzle, balancing national security concerns with the humanitarian desire to reunite families, complicated by the unexpected, quiet integration some had found in temporary American life. For Helga, the paradox of America's arsenal finally made sense. It was not just the visible might of tanks and planes, but the unseen continuous hum of factories, the vast, fertile fields, the sheer, unbombed scale of cities glimpsed from train windows, the aroma of abundant food on their tables. It was this total capacity that truly decided the war. Her small, creased photograph of her family, once a symbol of desperate hope against overwhelming odds, now represented a poignant reminder of a world that had fundamentally misjudged its adversary. The war's end brought not only the prospect of returning home, but also the quiet, profound understanding of a power far beyond what she or her nation had ever imagined. What aspects of wartime propaganda do you think had the most lasting impact on people's perceptions? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to uncover more untold stories from history, don't forget to subscribe to Whispers from WW2 for our next investigation.